Long before the United States was born, 13 scattered colonies clung to the edge of a vast wilderness. They fought hunger, disease, and empires, building a world that would one day defy a king. This is where America began, in struggle, faith, and fire. They came seeking fortune, freedom, and faith, but found starvation, war, and betrayal. From Jamestown's muddy banks to the battlefields of the French and Indian War, the story of colonial America is one of survival against impossible odds. Every great nation has an origin story. For America, it began here in the 1600s, when small wooden ships carried big dreams across the Atlantic. What started as fragile colonies would grow into a force that changed the world. Gold, God, and glory, the three forces that drove Europe across the ocean. But on this new continent, a different kind of story took shape. One of courage, conflict, and the birth of a new identity. American. Before the revolution. Before the flag. Here were settlers, soldiers, slaves, and native nations, each shaping a land that would one day call itself America. Before the world knew America, the oceans were vast and mysterious. During the late 1500s, European nations were filled with ambition and competition. Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands looked outward, determined to claim new lands and expand their influence. They were driven by three powerful motives: the search for wealth, the desire to spread religion, and the pursuit of political power. The economic motive came first. Europe's rulers and merchants were hungry for gold, silver, spices, and trade routes. They wanted to reach Asia more quickly to control its valuable goods. The religious motive was equally strong. After years of conflict and reformations, many Christians believed it was their duty to spread their faith to new lands, while others simply wanted to escape persecution and find freedom to worship as they chose. The political motive bound it all together. Each empire sought glory, land, and dominance in a growing world order. By the end of the 16th century, Europe's imagination was captured by the sea. Ships became symbols of progress and ambition. New maps appeared every year, filled with guesses, legends, and hopes. Explorers who dared to cross the Atlantic were treated as heroes, even if few of them returned rich. The dangers were immense: storms, disease, starvation, and the unknown coastlines of continents no one in Europe truly understood. In 1497, the English crown sent a man named John Cabot, an Italian navigator working for King Henry VII, to search for a western route to Asia. Sailing across the cold waters of the North Atlantic, Cabot reached the coast of North America, perhaps Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, and claimed the land for England. Though he found no gold or passage to Asia, his voyage marked the first English claim to the continent. England had entered the competition for the New World. Not long after, in 1524, another Italian explorer, Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailed west under the French flag. His mission was to chart the Atlantic coastline of North America. He explored from the Carolinas northward, observing bays, rivers, and harbors. Verrazzano's detailed notes gave France its earliest knowledge of the continent and encouraged more voyages across the Atlantic. A decade later came Jacques Cartier, also sailing for France. Between 1534 and 1541, Cartier made 3 voyages to the northern regions of the continent. He explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence and traveled up the great river that bears his name, the St. Lawrence River. Cartier met the Iroquois people and recorded their way of life. He claimed the region for France, calling it New France. Although he did not find the route to Asia he had hoped for, Cartier's journeys established a lasting French presence in North America. Through the 16th century, Spain continued to dominate much of the Americas, growing rich on gold and silver from its colonies. France, England, and the Netherlands, late to the race, sought new territories farther north. They learned from Spain's example that the New World could bring power and fortune, but only through risk, settlement, and persistence. By the start of the 1600s, European rivalry intensified. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway for explorers, traders, and dreamers. The idea of empire had taken hold. Colonies were seen as sources of wealth, trade, and influence. Across Europe, companies were formed to fund new voyages. Maps now showed North America not as an empty unknown, but as a land waiting to be claimed. In 1607, a Frenchman named Samuel de Champlain carried this vision forward. Champlain sailed up the St. Lawrence River and founded Quebec, the first permanent French settlement in North America. From that moment, France began to build its empire in the New World. Champlain was more than a soldier and explorer. He was a diplomat and a writer. He worked to understand the indigenous peoples of the region, forming alliances with the Huron and documenting their customs. His approach to colonization was based on partnership and trade rather than conquest alone. The foundation of Quebec marked a turning point. Exploration was no longer just about finding routes and drawing maps. It had become about building communities, creating trade networks, and laying the groundwork for empire. The French established fur trading posts and missions, while the English and Dutch began to plant their own settlements farther south. The struggle for North America had begun. By the middle of the 17th century, the outlines of three major colonial powers were visible on the map: Spain in the south and west, France along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, and England along the Atlantic coast. What had started as exploration for gold and glory had become a contest for land, resources, and survival. The age of exploration was not just a story of discovery. It was a story of human ambition and the meeting of worlds. European ships brought tools, weapons, and faith, but they also brought diseases that devastated native populations. In return, explorers encountered societies older and more complex than they had ever imagined. The exchange between these worlds would reshape both sides of the Atlantic forever. By 1763, the consequences of these first voyages were clear. The seeds of empire planted by explorers like Cabot, Verrazzano, Cartier, and Champlain had grown into colonies that would change the course of history. The search for Asia had failed, but what they found instead was something greater, the beginning of a new chapter in human civilization. The age of exploration had ended, but the story of America had just begun. In 1607, a fleet of 3 English ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, arrived on the shores of what is now Virginia. Aboard were 104 men and boys, driven by ambition, adventure, and the promise of wealth in the New World. They named their settlement Jamestown in honor of King James I, whose support had made their voyage possible. The location they chose, a bend along the James River, offered deep water for docking and a defensible position against potential attacks. Yet, the marshy land brought hidden dangers, mosquitoes carrying disease, brackish water that could not be drunk, and a climate harsh to those unprepared for its extremes. Survival proved immediately difficult. Settlers faced famine, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy, the powerful network of Native American tribes in the region. Leadership struggled, and nearly half the colony perished within the first year. Despite these hardships, the Jamestown settlers endured, learning to adapt to the land and to rely on both ingenuity and the cautious diplomacy of John Smith, whose leadership and strict discipline kept the colony from collapse. By planting crops, building fortifications, and establishing trade with the Powhatan people, the English began to transform Jamestown from a fragile outpost into a permanent foothold in the Americas. It was a precarious beginning, but one that marked the first enduring English presence in the New World, setting the stage for centuries of colonization that would follow. Survival in Jamestown remained a daily struggle. The settlers faced what would come to be known as the starving time during the winter of 1609-1610, when food shortages, disease, and harsh conditions decimated the population. Desperation drove some to extreme measures, and only the arrival of new supplies and reinforcements prevented the colony from disappearing entirely. Amid these hardships, the colony began to find a path to stability through a single, transformative crop: tobacco. Introduced by John Rolfe in 1612, tobacco quickly became Virginia's economic lifeline. Its rich, sweet leaves appealed to European markets, and Jamestown transformed from a struggling settlement into a center of profitable commerce. Plantations expanded along the James River, relying increasingly on indentured servants, and later, enslaved Africans, to cultivate the land. The tobacco economy reshaped Jamestown and its society. Wealth and land ownership defined status, while the relentless pursuit of profit led to tensions with both the Powhatan people and within the colony itself. Yet, the success of tobacco ensured Jamestown's survival, cementing the English foothold in North America and proving that permanent settlement was possible in a land so distant and unforgiving. From the brink of collapse, Jamestown emerged as a symbol of resilience and adaptation, laying the foundation for the English colonial system that would soon stretch across the continent. By the mid-1600s, England had firmly planted its presence along the eastern coast of North America, creating 13 distinct colonies that stretched from the rocky shores of New England to the warm southern tidewaters. These colonies, though under the same crown, developed unique identities shaped by geography, religion, and economy. In the north, the New England Colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire were largely driven by the search for religious freedom and the desire to build closely knit communities. In 1620, the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower, enduring a harsh winter with the guidance and support of Native Americans like Squanto. Their survival forged a legacy of cooperation and resilience, commemorated in the first Thanksgiving of 1621. A decade later, Puritans under John Winthrop founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, envisioning it as a city upon a hill, a model of moral and religious order. Yet, dissent inevitably emerged. Roger Williams established Rhode Island in 1636 to protect religious liberty, while Thomas Hooker led settlers to Connecticut, emphasizing representative governance. New Hampshire grew from fishing settlements along the coast, and the region's economy thrived on fishing, shipbuilding, lumber, and trade, with education highly valued. Harvard was founded in 1636. To the Middle Colonies, stretching from New York through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, came a diverse population of Dutch, English, Germans, Swedes, and others. Fertile soil and a moderate climate fostered prosperous farms and bustling commerce. New York, originally the Dutch New Netherland, founded in 1624, fell into English hands in 1664, becoming a key port city. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn as a holy experiment, became a beacon of religious tolerance and fair dealings with Native Americans, while Philadelphia rose as a major trade center. Smaller colonies like Delaware and New Jersey grew as hubs of agriculture and trade. Here, wheat fields, ironworks, and shipyards defined daily life, while cities became melting pots of culture, language, and religion. In the South, the colonies of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia developed along a very different path. Fertile land and warm climates created ideal conditions for plantations, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Enslaved Africans became central to Southern prosperity, their labor underpinning an economy that enriched a planter elite while entrenching a rigid social hierarchy. Maryland, founded by Lord Baltimore in 1634, provided a haven for Catholics, codified by the Act of Toleration in 1649. Which granted freedom of worship to Christians. The Carolinas, founded in 1663 and later split into North and South, saw Charleston flourish as a wealthy port city. Georgia, established in 1733 by James Oglethorpe, served as a refuge for debtors and a strategic buffer against Spanish Florida. Across the southern colonies, society was sharply divided. Wealthy planters at the top, small farmers and laborers in the middle, and enslaved people forming the backbone of the economy at the bottom. From Puritan towns to Quaker cities, and from tobacco plantations to rice fields, the 13 colonies were already carving distinct paths, laying the foundations of a future nation shaped by diverse peoples, economies, and beliefs. Life in the English colonies was as varied as the lands themselves. From the cold, rocky coastlines of New England to the fertile farmlands of the South, the colonists built new communities that blended Old World traditions with New World realities. Each region developed its own rhythm of daily life, shaped by climate, economy, and culture. In New England, towns grew close and compact. Wooden houses clustered around village greens, where meeting houses stood as both church and town hall. Religion guided community life. Sunday sermons and daily labor were viewed as acts of devotion. Families worked together, with men tending farms or trades, women managing households, and children helping from an early age. Education was valued not only for practical purposes, but as a means to read the Bible, leading to some of the earliest schools and colleges in America. The people here lived simply, bound by faith, discipline, and the shared effort to survive in a rugged landscape. Further south in the Middle Colonies, diversity was the hallmark of daily life. Farmers worked fertile fields of wheat and corn, producing enough to feed both local communities and export to Europe. Craftsmen, merchants, and sailors filled the busy streets of towns like Philadelphia and New York, where markets hummed with many languages and customs. Religious freedom fostered tolerance, and the mix of Quakers, Lutherans, Jews, Catholics, and others gave rise to a culture of openness rarely seen in Europe. Here, hard work was rewarded, but cooperation and coexistence were equally prized. In the southern colonies, life revolved around the land. Vast plantations stretched along rivers and coastal plains, worked by enslaved Africans whose labor sustained the wealth of the few. The planter class lived in large homes, overseeing both crops and commerce, while smaller farmers and laborers struggled to make a living on the margins. Life in the countryside was more isolated. Towns were fewer, schools rare, and churches distant. Yet communities formed their own bonds through shared dependence, hospitality, and faith. For the enslaved, daily life was marked by hardship, but also by endurance and cultural strength. Through song, storytelling, and faith, they preserved traditions that would one day influence the spirit of the entire nation. Across all 13 colonies, a sense of identity was slowly taking shape. Though separated by distance, belief, and wealth, the colonists shared an emerging pride in their self-reliance and freedom. Their towns, farms, and families became living symbols of perseverance in a new land, each generation more rooted, more confident, and more distinct from the England they had left behind. As the colonies grew, so too did their sense of independence. Far from the watchful eye of the English crown, settlers learned to govern themselves out of necessity. What began as small councils and town meetings gradually evolved into structured governments, each colony developing its own form of leadership and law. In New England, democracy took root in the meeting houses that stood at the heart of every town. Here, citizens gathered to debate local matters, vote on laws, and elect officials. A tradition born from the Puritan belief that moral communities must govern themselves. These town meetings fostered a spirit of participation and accountability that would become a defining feature of American political life. The Middle Colonies, diverse in people and faith, favored tolerance and balance in their governance. Colonial assemblies gave voice to merchants, landowners, and artisans alike, while proprietary colonies like Pennsylvania thrived under charters that allowed broad freedoms. William Penn's frame of government encouraged elected representation and protected individual rights, an early echo of the democratic ideals that would one day shape the nation. In the southern colonies, politics reflected the plantation hierarchy. Wealthy planters dominated local assemblies, while county courts handled disputes and governance across wide rural areas. Yet even here, the idea of self-rule took firm hold. Colonists grew accustomed to managing their own affairs, taxation, defense, and trade, often with little interference from royal officials an ocean away. The English crown still maintained authority through appointed governors, but these governors often found themselves challenged by local assemblies that guarded their power jealously. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies were not merely extensions of England. They were societies that had learned to think and act for themselves. Their councils, charters, and assemblies became the training ground for liberty, and in those early debates and votes lay the first quiet stirrings of a revolution yet to come. The prosperity of the colonies was built not only on hard labor and fertile soil, but on the ever-turning wheels of trade. From small village markets to bustling seaports, the English colonies became vital links in a vast web of commerce that spanned the Atlantic. In New England, the rocky soil offered little for large-scale farming, but the colonists turned their hands to the sea. Ships built in local yards carried fish, lumber, and furs to distant ports. Coastal towns like Boston and Salem thrived as centers of shipbuilding, trade, and navigation. Merchant vessels crisscrossed the Atlantic, bringing back molasses, rum, and manufactured goods from Europe and the Caribbean. The ocean became their lifeline. Dangerous, unpredictable, but full of promise. The Middle Colonies prospered as the breadbasket of North America. Fields of golden wheat and barley stretched across the countryside, feeding not just local families, but markets abroad. Farmers brought their harvests to cities like Philadelphia and New York, where merchants traded grain, iron, and livestock for European wares. Rivers served as natural highways, carrying goods from inland farms to coastal ports, fueling both commerce and community. Further south, the southern colonies turned agriculture into empire. Vast plantations of tobacco, rice, and indigo flowed outward to England in exchange for tools, cloth, and luxury goods. This plantation economy relied heavily on enslaved Africans, whose forced labor generated immense wealth for planters while creating unimaginable suffering for those who toiled in the fields. The profits from these exports bound the southern colonies to the rhythms of global trade and to the moral contradictions that would one day tear the nation apart. The Atlantic itself became the artery of an economic system known as the triangular trade. Ships carried enslaved Africans to the Americas, raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe, and finished goods back across the ocean. The system enriched merchants and fueled the rise of colonial cities, but it also revealed the darker side of expansion, the human cost hidden behind prosperity. By the mid-1700s, the English colonies had become deeply connected to the global economy. Their docks bustled with ships and sailors, their warehouses filled with goods from across the world. Yet, with every transaction, a quiet sense of strength was growing. The colonists were no longer dependent settlers. They were traders, producers, and builders of wealth. In their growing confidence and control over commerce lay the early signs of a power that could one day rival the empire itself. As the English colonies grew in strength and number, their expansion brought both opportunity and unrest. The wilderness that had once seemed boundless now became a contested frontier, where settlers and native nations met in uneasy coexistence that too often gave way to violence. In the earliest years, cooperation was possible. Native tribes taught settlers to plant corn, hunt local game, and survive the harsh seasons. Trade in furs and food built fragile alliances, and for a time, both peoples found benefit in each other's presence. But as the colonies expanded, the hunger for land pushed deeper into native territories, and mutual trust gave way to fear and bloodshed. In New England, tensions erupted in the Pequot War of 1637, when English settlers and their native allies destroyed the Pequot tribe after a brutal conflict born from trade disputes and mistrust. 4 decades later, the region again burned during King Philip's War, 1675-1676, as the Wampanoag leader Metacom, called King Philip by the English, united tribes in a desperate struggle to resist colonial expansion. The war left towns in ashes, thousands dead, and native resistance shattered. Survivors were killed, enslaved, or forced westward, marking the beginning of a long, tragic displacement that would continue for generations. Even as the settlers battled with native nations, another struggle unfolded on a much larger stage. The great European empires, England and France chief among them, vied for dominance across North America. Their global rivalries spilled into the colonies in a series of wars that reshaped the continent. King William's War, 1689 to 1697, and Queen Anne's War, 1702-1713, pitted English and French settlers against one another, drawing in native allies on both sides. Frontier villages were raided and burned, and the boundaries between war and survival blurred. King George's War, 1744-1748, brought further destruction, leaving both sides weary but unresolved. Finally came the most decisive conflict of all, the French and Indian War, 1754-1763. Known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, it was a battle for control of the vast interior of North America. British colonists, allied with some native nations, fought against the French and their native allies for supremacy over the continent's trade and territory. The war's outcome would forever alter the balance of power. France lost nearly all its claims in North America, and Britain emerged as the dominant colonial power. Yet victory came at a cost. The war left Britain deep in debt, and its leaders looked to the colonies to help pay the price. New taxes, tighter control, and growing resentment would soon transform old loyalties into open defiance. The seeds of revolution had been planted. not in the halls of Parliament, but in the forests and fields where the colonies had fought and survived together. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, marked the final decisive struggle for control of North America, a clash not only between Britain and France, but between two visions of empire. Though fought on colonial soil, it was part of a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, a confrontation that spanned continents and seas. The spark came in the wilderness of the Ohio River Valley, where both Britain and France claimed the same fertile lands. There, a young and ambitious officer named George Washington led a small Virginia militia to challenge French forces building forts along the frontier. At Fort Necessity in 1754, his troops were overwhelmed and Washington was forced to surrender, an early defeat that foreshadowed the long and brutal conflict to come. The early years of the war brought more disasters for the British. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led a large force against the French stronghold of Fort Duquesne, only to be ambushed and destroyed in the thick forests of Pennsylvania. Colonial militias were poorly organized, British generals unfamiliar with the terrain, and native alliances largely favored the French, who fought with skill and mobility. For a time, France seemed destined to dominate the continent, but in 1757 the tide began to turn. Under the leadership of William Pitt, Britain poured money, men, and naval power into the war. New strategies emphasized colonial cooperation, and the once divided colonies rallied to the fight. The British Navy cut off French supplies while armies advanced along the St. Lawrence River. In 1759, a daring assault on the cliffs of Quebec brought the turning point. British General James Wolfe defeated the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, in a battle that claimed both their lives. A year later, Montreal fell, ending French rule in Canada and bringing the long struggle to its close. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, redrew the map of North America. France surrendered all its mainland territories, ceding Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. To compensate its ally, Spain received Louisiana from France. Britain now stood as the dominant empire in North America, its flag flying from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. Yet victory came with a heavy price. The war had drained Britain's treasury, leaving it burdened with debt. To recover the cost, Parliament began to tax its colonies, expecting loyalty and obedience in return for protection. But the colonists, who had fought and bled beside British soldiers, saw things differently. They had defended their homes, proven their strength, and tasted unity. Beneath the surface of triumph, tension was already brewing, tension that would soon ignite a revolution. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763 brought a wave of pride and relief to Britain and its colonies alike. The French threat had vanished, and the British flag now flew over vast new lands. Yet beneath the triumph, fault lines were already forming. Victory had been costly, financially and politically, and in the uneasy peace that followed, old allies would begin to drift apart. For Britain, the war had doubled the national debt. Maintaining troops in America and governing new territories required money, and Parliament turned to the colonies for help. From London's perspective, it was only fair. The colonies had benefited from the war and from British protection. But the colonists saw things differently. They believed they had already paid their share in blood, and they resented being taxed by a distant government in which they had no voice. The first signs of strain appeared with the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Britain hoped to prevent further wars with native tribes, but colonists, especially veterans and land speculators, saw it as an unjust barrier to opportunity. The frontier that had promised freedom was suddenly closed by royal decree. Then came the taxes. The Sugar Act 1764 and Stamp Act 1765 imposed new duties on goods and printed materials, sparking outrage from Boston to Charleston. For the first time, the colonies united in protest, insisting that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. Boycotts, petitions, and fiery speeches spread through the colonies, giving rise to a shared sense of defiance. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 marked one of the first steps toward colonial unity, while groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged to resist British authority in the streets. Britain repealed the Stamp Act after fierce opposition, but the damage was done. Distrust had taken root. Townshend Acts, 1767, followed, taxing imports like glass, tea, and paper. British soldiers were stationed in colonial cities to enforce order, and their presence only deepened resentment. In 1770, tensions erupted into violence when British troops fired on unarmed civilians in the Boston Massacre, killing 5. What began as protest now felt like occupation. As Parliament continued to assert control, the colonists organized. They exchanged letters through committees of correspondence, coordinated boycotts, and sharpened their arguments for liberty. When Britain passed the Tea Act, was 1773, granting a monopoly to the struggling East India Company, Boston rebels struck back. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, they boarded ships and dumped crates of tea into the harbor in the bold act of defiance known as the Boston Tea Party. London responded with fury. The Intolerable Acts, 1774, punished Massachusetts by closing its port and curbing self-government. Instead of dividing the colonies, the measures united them. Delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, calling for resistance and preparing for the possibility of war. By 1775, the bond between Britain and her colonies had frayed beyond repair. Soldiers stood ready, muskets loaded as whispers of rebellion filled taverns and churches alike. The colonies, once loyal subjects of a distant king, were beginning to see themselves as something new. A people bound not by empire, but by a shared belief in freedom. The road to revolution had begun. The colonial era left behind more than settlements and trade routes. It forged a people and a spirit that would define a nation. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, 13 scattered colonies had grown from fragile outposts into thriving societies, each shaped by struggle, faith, and perseverance. From the snow-covered meeting houses of New England to the tobacco fields of Virginia and the busy docks of Philadelphia, a new identity had begun to take form, distinct from Europe, yet rooted in its ideals. The colonists had learned to think and act for themselves. Distance from the crown and the hardships of frontier life nurtured independence, resourcefulness, and a belief in personal freedom. Communities that once depended on royal charters now governed through town meetings and assemblies, guided by the conviction that authority must rest with the people. The English traditions of liberty, representation, and law took deep root in American soil, reshaped by experience and necessity. Religious diversity flourished as well. Quakers, Puritans, Catholics, Jews, and countless others lived side by side, often uneasily, but together they helped build a society unlike any other in the world. From this diversity grew tolerance, and from tolerance, the idea that a free people might one day govern themselves without kings or lords. Yet even as the colonies matured, their success brought new conflict. The end of the French and Indian War had rid them of France, but bound them more tightly to Britain. To pay its debts, the crown turned to taxation and control, unaware that the seeds of defiance had already taken root. The colonists who once saw themselves as proud English subjects now began to question their place in the empire. Thus, the legacy of the colonial era was both triumph and tension. Out of hardship came prosperity, out of obedience came independence, and out of loyalty came rebellion. The story of the colonies did not end with peace. It ended with awakening. The people of British America had grown into something new, not merely colonists, but Americans, ready to claim the freedom they had been quietly preparing for all along.